So yes, I'm Circe Jagd, to clarify. It's a weird one though, so I don't blame you at all. And yeah, I am one of the service desk engineers down at ezCater, and if I can get my windows to work, there we go, that's what I want. And yeah, I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about queer folks and why you don't see as many trans folk like myself kind of around in the tech sphere. So what exactly qualifies me to even talk about it? And really, who even am I to talk about anything? So from a professional experience, I've done everything from like cable installations, retail sales, networking, network architecture, a lot of that kind of thing. I also build computers, did a little bit of game design when I was younger, and I also have a theater degree, which I realize is a little weird for someone hanging out in technology, but it's pretty helpful, truthfully. In terms of hobbies, I do a lot of stuff, cosplay, I make comics. I also play Monster Hunter. If anyone needs a greatsword user, I'm there for you. But my point is that I honestly, despite my position, I am I'm better with people than I will ever be with technology. So a lot of what I really think about, a lot of what I want to do is kind of bring those two things closer together. Not necessarily in the transhumanist sense, but like I'm not going to turn down a cyborg arm, you know? Nonetheless, let's see. Let's actually get to why I'm really here, though. What I really want to talk to you all about is a little bit more relevant to my general identity. So I am a queer, bisexual, trans woman. And maybe I'm the first trans person you've met. Maybe I'm the weirdest looking trans person you've met. I get that one a lot, but that's fine. Nonetheless, my pronouns are she, her, for what it's worth. And I did want to give you the full label, but the real answer is that I do prefer just the term queer is generally enough. We're going to get into kind of a lot of these language differences and stuff like that. I've got the full acronym there for you. The most up-to-date one, I would say, kind of used by the community being LGBTQIA+, with a nice kind of explanation of exactly what that's about. The lesser-known ones that are on there you may not have heard before being queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and the plus to include a lot of other folks who may not hit those categories but are somewhere else on the gender or sexuality spectrum. Your non-binary folks, genderqueer, gender fluid folks. There's a lot. The point is that we're always kind of searching for an umbrella term. And in this case, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going with the academic term, which is queer. Most of us, truthfully, are fine with going by that label, but it does have some roots in it as a slur, especially in certain areas where transphobia is especially bad, or homophobia is especially bad, I should say. But for the most part, it's a reclaimed word. It's fairly common in the community. I don't necessarily recommend using it on your company policy documents. The acronym will work fine here. But why? But what really I want to talk about is not where I am, because truthfully, I'm doing all right. I want to talk about why you should care where other queer folks are, be that trans folks, gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, intersex, ace, whatever. The fact is, there's a real plight being faced by those people. And you should care because it's, the right thing to do. Absolutely. We have a moral imperative. We've decided that as a society, we want to be an open, accepting one. So we do have a moral imperative to look at these issues and figure out what we can do, why you don't see queer people in a lot of media, why I might be the first deep-voiced trans woman you've ever heard speak. Why is that? So that's kind of what I dug into to kind of figure out, especially in the tech sphere, kind of what the situation is. In addition to kind of that moral argument, we do know, at least as of a 2017 Gallup poll, about 4.5% of Americans identify as, in the case of that poll, LGBT. Again, language changes. Obviously, though, we do also know on kind of an intrinsic level that number is unreported. There are lots of people for whom it is dangerous to come out, for it is dangerous to fill out that kind of census information, and so that number is lower than the actual amount of queer folk in the United States in all likelihood. But the other thing to really keep in mind, that's from 2017, and we especially are seeing trending with the younger demographic, generation, forgive me, and a lot of others, that more and more folks are identifying with these queer labels, be that queer itself, gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary, etc. There are more and more of us every year. So even if you don't, for some reason, take the moral argument, understand you are going to see more queer people going forward, and you should see more queer people going forward. This is all about what you can do. This is all about kind of how you can face the future moving forward in this. And also, it's to highlight the fact that despite these growing demographics, despite all of this, all of the what I feel is positive change in kind of the American zeitgeist, most states still don't have workplace protections for queer folk. 30 of the 50 have none whatsoever in terms of protections for being gay, trans, etc. And that combined with the fact that you're more likely to be discriminated against when it comes to training, hiring, etc. as a queer person, has led to the kind of the situation that we're in. What situation is she talking about, huh? So let's take a look at that situation. It's not great. As you can probably imagine, and kind of what I was getting at, a lot of this data isn't quite filled out the way that it is for a lot of other demographics. And that's really it. We normally rely on demographic information to kind of see where things are going. But because of the societal ramifications of identifying as a queer person, that data is not accurate. And we need more of it. There aren't enough studies in the tech tech sector especially, but in employment in general. We just simply don't know where our queer people are, who is identifying as queer, questioning, or any other identity, and why, and kind of in a more scientific sense, what their struggles are. We do know, again, this is another 2017 study, but folks who had left technology jobs who identified as queer individuals cited, I say simple, but bullying as part of why they even left their tech sector jobs, which definitely indicates a fairly major cultural problem that we just don't have data on. So obviously, the societal pressures at hand are going to have a lot to do with that. But we still, whenever we ask this question, why is tech not more diverse than it currently is? We have to start there. We have to start at kind of the entrenched culture that's in tech. And I apologize, because whenever you said, hey, what do you geek out about? I geek out about queer liberation. So I'm just going to keep going here. The other part of this, though, and I think a little bit more telling, is another study by an organization called Blind did an anonymous survey on how safe people felt about their workplaces, specifically for queer individuals. And when cisgender heteronormative folks were asked that, in 2019, about 91% of them said, oh yeah, the queer people who work here are safe. In 2020, that's down to about 86%. I think there's a little bit of interest to be drawn there, but without more data, we can't really see the whole trend. But what's interesting instead is the gap. You see, that's kind of how the cishet people felt. That's just a shortening of cisgender heteronormative, because it doesn't make my tongue want to jump out of my mouth when I say it. But for actual queer folk, for LGBTQ folks, as well as our transgender, our gender non-conforming folks. So again, that's folks that don't necessarily fit on one side of the scale or the other. That number is much lower, being 83% for the majority of queer folks in 2019, 78% for transgender folks in that same year, and down even further, 76 and 64 percentage points in 2020. So that again kind of speaks to how much of these entrenched cultures that we're really dealing with when it comes to queer liberation, queer workplace issues. So that's where we're at. Where should we go? Where can we go? How do we get there? That's really what's important. And that's really what I want to share with you today, assuming my window wants to stop hiding from me. So why does this happen? As I said before, part of that is those kind of entrenched demographics, so the boys club problem that I was talking about previously. Whenever you see surveys, this particular one was from Stack Overflow. They surveyed their developers, and the vast majority, 92.6% of them were straight or heterosexual. You had much smaller amounts of bisexual, gay or lesbian, or queer identities. And when it came to transgender identity, the 0.9% responded that they held a transgender identity. That is a startling lack of diversity. Consider, especially when generally the number that's thrown around is that the general population is about 1.0% trans. And that's disputed based on a bunch of different sources, but it's somehow averaging even lower among technology developers. So there's definitely a culture thing we've really got to get at there. Now, outside of that, and a little bit more concrete, is that because of the lack of workplace protections, the vast majority of companies, whether they're technology space or not, are lacking in what trans people really need and what queer people really need in terms of their healthcare. Things like gender confirmation surgeries, things like hormone replacement therapy. Even if these are covered by your insurance, it's generally not spelled out. There's no way to know unless you're actually hired and call the insurance provider to have that awkward conversation where you have to ask them if it's going to be okay for you to transition. And that environment is not super conducive to me as a trans person choosing to work for your company. We'll get into kind of what you can do there, but for a start, find out what your insurance covers. It may not be a policy, something you ever need. It may not be something anyone currently in your company needs, but someone is going to see it. Someone is going to see that your company is willing to do it, is willing to publicize that they are willing to do what has to be done for queer healthcare, and that is going to make them apply for your company. That is going to make them interested in your company. That is going to make them want to be a part of your organization. Part of that also is going to be refining our hiring pipelines, because outside of the companies themselves, who are we going through for our hiring? If, for instance, you're going through a third party, you're bringing in a lot of contractors, notice the demographics that you bring in. I've definitely been in series of interviews, both for a position similar to my own and filling contractor positions where we only got straight cis male candidates. So you may have to even examine those pipelines, see what is coming into your people team, and how can you better partner with those organizations to make sure they have those kind of diversity goals in mind too, because they're definitely a part of this. And that gets us to just kind of the last part of this is going to be entrenched folks who maybe don't understand that the company wants to move towards supporting more diversity, maybe don't recognize their kind of unintentional biases. And this isn't something necessarily malevolent that they're trying to do. It's simply that queer identities are coming to the fore in a way that they haven't in decades because of the work of the queer liberation movement. Some people need to be refreshed on kind of what's acceptable now versus what wasn't maybe acceptable when they were hired 20 years ago. But so that talks about kind of what the situation we're looking at is. What really, though, can we do about it? And thankfully, I do have some kind of basic answers for what to really look at, what we can do within our own organizations immediately to kind of address some of these problems. First and foremost, look, and a lot of you, thankfully, a lot of companies are already doing this, which is great. Look at your company policies, look at your language, and see if it needs to be updated. Maybe you could very well have language that made sense 10 years ago, but is not inclusive now. If you have a lot of he or she's in those company policies, a lot of he/she's, if you use husband and wife instead of spouse, you can easily fix that stuff. And even if it doesn't seem like a big deal, whenever I, as a trans person, as a queer person, see that you've made that effort, I know that you're going to have my back if I want to bring my wife or husband in, if I want to bring my non-binary spouse in. I know that it's not a big deal. I know that I'm not going to have to educate you on that language. And I know that they're going to be respected just like I'm going to be. And the other part of that, from a more kind of workplace area, is accessible facilities. Gender neutral bathrooms are kind of a political football right at the moment, but they are genuinely helpful, not just to the queer folks, not just to gender non-binary folks or questioning folks who may be more comfortable in that space. They're useful to everybody. If you just are not having a great day and you don't feel like dealing with bathroom chatter, a gender-neutral bathroom is great. If maybe you need to pump, if you need to maybe, I don't know, help an elderly family member, there are so many use cases for gender-neutral bathrooms. And as a trans person, as a queer person, when I see them, again, I understand, especially when you're beginning to transition, that a gendered bathroom is terrifying. When I began, I was nowhere near this gorgeous. And a women's bathroom absolutely gave me a panic attack. I eventually had to face that. I eventually had to go in because where I was working at the time didn't have another option. I could very well have been harassed. Thankfully, I wasn't. But that anxiety is with every gender nonconforming, every non-binary, and every trans person, and having a way to just not deal with that for 10 minutes is excellent. And that's why those gender-neutral bathrooms, those gender-neutral gym stalls and the like, wellness rooms even, are important because we need that escape sometimes, all of us. And it just shows how accepting and willing you are to give it to your people. And for my final point, regarding what trans people are really looking for when they're looking at your company, when you're looking at keeping the queer individuals that you do have, make sure to explicitly state that your benefits cover what they care about. Ultimately, we want to know that you're willing to cover a gender confirmation surgery. Maybe it's not something that needs to be, broadcast all the time. It doesn't have to be in the first meeting you have or the first interview. But to save us that awkward conversation, to just explicitly state you have that support for queer liberation is incredible and will do so much to just help us be able to trust you, because that's really a lot of what this is that trans people cannot trust the establishment the way that cis people can, that queer people cannot trust the establishment the way that straight people can. And explicitly saying you have support for those things, those surgeries, hormone therapy, mental health resources, which are just statistically more likely to be used by queer folk. All of those things tell us that you have our back, and that's really what we want to see. So that is, believe it or not, the end of this long spiel. I appreciate you all sitting with me. If you have any questions that I can answer, obviously I'll hang out here for a bit. That's my email, LinkedIn, and Twitter. I will also put out a bibliography with all of the sources I looked at for today's talk. Thank you again for listening for this.